Nudity, a festival with a name you might raise an eyebrow to, and a spell. It's time to explore 3 festivals in February on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil, and in this episode I'm continuing with the festivals in Ancient Rome mini-series with a look at February and 3 festivals which took place in that month. In the first episode I discussed the development of the Roman calendar and January. You don't have to have listened to it as these are standalone episodes, but it might give you some more context, and dare I say, you might even enjoy it. I also spoke briefly about Ovid, a poet who wrote the Fasti, which described Roman festivals and supplies us with some invaluable information about what went on. That said, there is always the caveat when using source material which relates to, well, how reliable it is. You can find episode notes with a transcription, reading list and other info on my website ancientblogger.com, along with all sorts of other ancient history content. Go and check it out. You can also find me as Ancient Blogger on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and with a channel on YouTube. It's all ancient history, just in case you wondered. This podcast has its own subreddit called Ancient History Hound on, and I never know how to say this, well, Reddit. I put links to episodes there and all sorts of other content, so if you're on Reddit, come and join the fun. Finally, reviews and ratings. If you've got the option on the platform you use for podcasts to give a rating, please do so. And this includes Spotify, where you can actually leave me individual messages on any episode you've listened to. And I always like to try and get back to people who've done that. So, in short, keep rating and reviewing wherever you can, as it's great to hear from you, and it does help with the whole marketing thing, because believe it or not, you are the marketing. Anyway, let's get on with it, and let's get to February. In the previous episode, I spoke about how January took its name from Janus, and how the sources were all in agreement with this. February, however, presents us with a very different situation. The theme of the month was certain. It was a month dedicated to purification, but our sources weren't exactly sure where it took its name from. Ovid gives us one contender, Februar. This is the name given to a range of objects used in purification, and in particular one which I'll be mentioning later, the goat hide strips used in the Lupercalia. Another candidate was a rather mysterious deity called Februs. He was a god of purification mentioned by later writers such as Macrobius and John the Lydian. In fact, the latter, in his work on pagan festivals, linked Februs to an underworld Etruscan deity. Perhaps this was a fuller manifestation of an earlier thought that the god and rite had non-Roman beginnings, as Varro, writing in the 1st century BC and therefore much more within the period I'm focusing on, noted that Februm is the name that the Sabines gave to a purification ritual. We can draw some early conclusions given all of this. The first is that February was linked to purification, and via a couple of suggested etymologies. The second is that there may have been external influences in how all of this came about, as referenced by the mention of Sabines and Etruscans. This isn't necessarily a surprise. The month itself was apparently added to the Roman calendar by Numa. It's sometimes forgotten that Numa, with the caveat that he was likely a fictional character, he wasn't Roman, he was the second Roman king, was actually a Sabine and associated with creating Rome's religious infrastructure. Even if he didn't exist, Rome seems to have been happy to have cultivated a myth about a non-Roman ruler crafting its early religion and religious infrastructure. And just on that, it may or may not surprise you that Rome had a history of incorporating elements from other cultures into its religion, both in its early years and continuing on from there. A question you may have is, okay, purification was the theme of February, but why and what was the intention of this? A good way of approaching this is to consider purification as a way of maintaining good relations with the gods. One ritual which facilitated this was a lustratio, and though this varied, it was composed of some basic elements. The most distinct was the procession, which might be around the area that the ritual was focused on, or it could be symbolic. Illustratio would also involve prayers and sacrifice, and the idea was that by doing this, you would have engendered good relations with the gods or good outcomes which the gods presided over. Cato the Elder wrote a treatise on farming which dated to the mid-2nd century BC. This included illustratio to promote good fertility for a piece of land on a farm. This involved the procession, which was leading sacrificial animals around the land, sacrificing them, and making the required prayers. A more public illustratio was one conducted after a census at Rome, which was said to have taken place every 5 years. This took place at the Field of Mars, and around the area where the people had gathered. It was an important ritual. Augustus performed this in 28 BC and boasted about doing so in his Res Gestae. Sometimes illustratio or similar rite was a response to a specific emergency. Perhaps there'd been a bad omen, a sacrifice had been performed incorrectly, or something similar. In those instances, Rome turned to its priests to work out what was needed. This might involve consulting the Sibylline books. I won't be including these type of rituals, but I thought it good to point out that Rome had a religious framework which was quite dynamic and capable of responding to unique situations. The first festival is a good example of a few themes you'll be hearing about in this episode. It was called the Fornicalia. Yes, you heard that correctly. Stop giggling. This was a celebration of ovens. Like the Compitalia, which I mentioned in January's episode, it was known as a Fere Conceptive, or movable feast, which meant that it didn't have a set date for its beginning. However, it did have an end date. Confused and still thinking, Fornicalia, really? Good, stay with me. Much like many festivals, this one was said to have been established by Numa, as mentioned, Rome's second king. Though this was a public festival, it wasn't undertaken by the whole citizenry in Rome at the same time, but through citizen groups known as curia. By the time of the imperial period, there were 30 of these curia, each with its own name and history. The feast would have taken place at that curia's meeting place or feasting hall, or wherever it needed to use. The date was set by the official presiding over the curia, hence there not being a fixed start date, because you couldn't have all of these presumably on the same day. The person in charge of the curia that you belong to would simply let you know. There was, or rather seems to have been, a fixed end date for it, though, as mentioned, and this was on the 17th of February, when the final feast, the Feast of Fools, was staged. The curious name comes from its function, to provide the ritual, a sacrifice and feast to those who weren't sure what curia they belonged to. Plutarch, in his Roman Questions, does give a couple reasons why you might not have been able to attend other than just not knowing what curia you're in. Perhaps you're away on business or ill or simply not able to attend. And I suspect that even if that wasn't the case, you'd probably want to say something like that rather than being considered a fool. The next festival was a bit like the Fornicalia in that it took place over a number of days, but this one was very much assigned to a set of dates in February. Running from the 13th to the 21st was the Parentalia. During this time, temples were closed and marriage was forbidden. It was a festival in which families made offerings to the ancestral dead, or manes. The name of the festival is thought to refer to this aspect. The Latin word parentes could mean parents, but also ancestors, and this could mean an immediate family member, say a child. Ovid, in his work The Fasti, had some interesting comments about the Parentalia, including a ritual spell. It was apparently Aeneas, a Trojan prince, who had brought the custom to what would become Rome. If you weren't aware, Aeneas escaped Troy and settled near to what would become Rome. This also means that this practice predated Romulus and Remus by many generations. This account is a good example of how Rome came to speculate and form foundation myths for many of its elements, from buildings to beliefs. It's probable that there was a type of ritual which looked to placate the spirits of the family unit going way back, but it was important that this important festival had a foundation myth which could be easily recognized. Ovid's description of the events includes a reference to the last day of the festival, known as the Feralia. The etymology of this has been debated. However, both Varro, a 1st century BC writer, and Ovid concluded that the word came from the verb to bring, ferre, with Varro adding that inferre, meaning the dead below, was involved as well. It's worth noting that though Ovid mentions the feralia, these events that he describes aren't necessarily only taking place on that last day. That would be improbable for reasons which I hope will become apparent. Bringing something to the dead was something described by Ovid. This would include food, for example bread soaked in wine and burnt offerings, but also decoration with the use of violets and garlands to decorate the tomb or gravestone. Ovid is at pains to emphasize that the dead were not greedy in needing sumptuous fare or lavish displays, though this was sometimes the case, as I'll get to shortly. For Ovid, this was a poignant moment, a family remembering the Manes by their tomb or grave. And yet, there was something else, something a bit more, sinister, and this reflects an important element of the parentalia. The Manes weren't gone, they were active and wandering around Rome. What better time for a ritual or spell to ask for their assistance? The ritual or spell was described by Ovid and took the following form, and I quote, "See, an old woman sitting amongst the girls performs the rites of Tacita the Silent, though she herself is not silent. With 3 fingers she sets 3 lumps of incense under the sill where the little mouse makes its secret path. Then she fastens enchanted threads together with dark lead and turns 7 black beans over and over in her mouth, and bakes the head of a sprat in the fire, mouth sewn up with pitch, pierced right through with a bronze needle. She drops wine on it too, and she or her friends drink the wine that's left, though she gets the most. On leaving, she says, 'We have sealed up hostile mouths and unfriendly tongues,' and the old woman exits drunk." End quote. To give some context, the character of Tacita mentioned here was the mother of the Lares, protective spirits who I mentioned in the previous episode with the Compitalia. Ovid gives her backstory as one in which she had her tongue removed by Jupiter for telling Juno, his wife, that Jupiter was infatuated with Juturna, Tacita's sister. This, and the sealing of the mouth of the fish, suggest that this was a ritual aimed at silencing the enemies of that family. If you listen to my episode on curse tablets and figurines, you might remember binding spells, which were intended to have a particular effect, for example, prevent a love affair or business from flourishing. A common type in ancient Greece was to silence people, and this within the context of that person acting as a witness in court. Perhaps then the old woman and her group of young girls was aiding a family in suppressing a rumour about them, or perhaps someone being a witness against them in court. It wasn't as if the Romans didn't avail themselves to both court cases and gossip. Asking for the Manes to assist the family requires them to have power, and this was certainly the case. These were not passive entities. Manes was seen by Romans as being capable of helping and harming, which is one reason why you wanted to keep them on side. There were rituals in Rome where the Manes of the people might help with agricultural fertility, and they might also help an army. A devotio hostium was a ritual a Roman general could perform, which pledged the lives of the enemy in a besieged city as offerings to Manes if they helped win the siege. On a more personal level, the Manes of a family were thought to help provide guidance, perhaps through dreams. Prayers made to them might also seek to extend the life of a person, with the implication that they could also control occurrences of death. The Manes of a family were therefore powerful entities, and the parentalia was crucial in maintaining a relationship with them. Where the parentalia bridged the gap between the living and the dead, it also linked the public and the private. Though the parentalia was essentially a private thing, it was also very public. The Romans buried their dead outside of the city. Tombs and graves were found in necropoles and alongside roads. In the case of the latter, popular spots would be near to the main gates to ensure as many passers-by as possible. In this sense, the places of the dead were far from hidden. The follow-on here is that there was an opportunity for Romans to showcase their wealth and grandeur. Perhaps this is what Ovid was sniping at earlier with the comment about the dead being happy with basic offerings and nothing too excessive. We might picture the parentalia taking place alongside roads or in an acropolis, and whilst people walked past or conducted theirs nearby. For the majority, especially the poor of Rome, the parentalia would have been a basic affair, but naturally some Romans wanted to ramp things up. Excavations at some necropoles have revealed a shared water supply, and even communal kitchens. There's even some indication of rooms where people might stay, and this probably results from families having to travel a distance. Stick a pin in that point for the moment, as I'll come back to it shortly. How then might a more elaborate ritual manifest exactly? Well, with inscriptions which reveal what went on. I'll start with a dedication made by Communus Abascantus to his wife, which took place each year at his garden tomb. This included 10 pairs of wrestlers, the winners getting 8 sesterces, the losers 4. There was also a feast at the dining hall above the tomb, which included local magistrates. It's estimated that there were 6 guests at 16 sesterces a head. The oil poured over his remains was nard oil, and this was very expensive. And then there, of course, was the sacrifice and the decoration of the tomb with violets. Another inscription, this time by a husband to his wife Clodia Achilles, carried details about how she was to be remembered. Her husband gave money to the local Severi Augustales, a professional association of freedmen, to have a libation poured for her on the parentalia and risalia. Valeria Ursa made arrangements before her death for herself and her husband. She left the money to a girls' youth organisation in Mediolanum, with pouring libations as well as laying rose garlands at their daughter's tomb at the time of the parentalia. In Pisa, Navius Restutus left 4,000 sesterces to the Association of the Shipbuilders, who were instructed to feast beside his tomb each year at the parentalia and risalia. There's quite a lot of information in these examples. The fact that associations were involved to continue the offerings, the feasts, and also the involvement of non-family members. I'm not going to chase this rabbit too far down a hole, but it seems to be that there are instances where the grave or tombside ritual involved non-family members. But how did this work, as presumably they had to conduct their own rites as well? Well, this might be why the festival covered the number of days it did, because you may not only conduct rites for the manes of your family, but be a guest at the rites for another. There's also the element of travel, which I mentioned earlier. The parentalia seems to have incorporated logistics which required it to be longer than just one day. The experience of a Roman family might be from performing a simple rite to essentially hosting something a bit more fancy, being a guest, and all the variations therein. Overarching all of this, though, was a sense that the Romans embraced this festival and had a genuine respect, affection, call it what you will, to their manes. Emotionally, it must have been a complex affair, remembering those long past you'd never met and those perhaps you'd been speaking to recently. Whatever the experience of the family, the central element was the same, to keep the manes happy, and this theme of familial balance was the feature of the Charistia, which took place on the 22nd, the day after. The main feature of this was a meal in which any issues or arguments in the family were set aside. Though we don't have a lustratio in place, both of these incorporate a theme I mentioned earlier, to regulate relationships both with the living and the dead. The next festival definitely did include a lustratio, and it was quite a sight. You want a solemn procession with prayers and the like? Look elsewhere, because on the 15th of February, the lustratio took the form of nude young men, armed with goat-hide thongs. This was the Lupercalia. I should add by mentioning that I did an episode specifically on the Lupercalia, which you can listen to, as it will include some details I won't mention here. Don't worry though, unlike those runners, I will cover the basics. The route the Lupercalia took has been argued, and in truth it may have changed at points, but we know it started at the Lupercal. This was the cave which supposedly was where the she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus lived. It then went round the Palatine Hill and ended in the Forum. The ending of the route of the Forum gave rise to one of history's famous moments, It was after running in the Lupercalia that Mark Antony offered Julius Caesar the crown, in fact a diadem, which Caesar refused. Cicero's attack on Mark Antony in his second Philippic included this event as well as Mark Antony's undress in the act as a further outrage. After a sacrifice had been made at the Lupercal, the runners, members of a priesthood known as the Luperci, set off. It wasn't a race, but there was a requirement that the runners strike or most likely tap women with goat hide thongs. I mentioned earlier that these were known as febra, and significant enough to be considered as the reason or one of the reasons behind February's name. To be struck by one of the runners, or rather the thong, was considered very lucky. In fact, it was thought that this would increase a woman's fertility, or if she was pregnant, help ensure a good birth. This then is a good example of a ritual which was formed of two separate elements, one of purification and one of fertility. But why exactly? Well, according to Livy, this element, the fertility element, was added in 276 BC following an outbreak of stillbirths in the city. Ovid, however, had his own mythical rationale. When the city, under Romulus, was suffering from a lack of children being born, the goddess Juno spoke from a sacred grove. Her words, "Let the sacred he-goat pierce the Italian wives," was interpreted as thongs being cut from the hide of a sacrificed goat and then used to hit the backs of wives to remedy the situation. In his History of Rome, Livy mentions elsewhere where Rome incorporated new elements into religious rites, for example, the inclusion of the lectisternium in the Saturnalia. It's plausible then that there was an addition to the original lustratio, though one argument I read posited that the use of the febra was always part of that original procession, the lustratio. During the procession, the febra may have been used in a symbolic context to avert pollution and malign influences by waving them around. This act was then later tweaked and repurposed as one which imbued fertility. A final point I want to make is that the Lupercalia took place during the Parentalia. On a wider note, it's good to realise that festivals sometimes overlapped, but here it may have been intentional. The purification through the Lupercalia acted as a check on those welcome but still possibly dangerous manes who were still in the city. It was a sort of ritual check and control on them. February had several other festivals, including the Terminalia, associated with boundary markers, and the Regifugium. We have sparse detail on either of these, with the latter associated in some way with the expulsion of the kings. This brings with it a perspective on festivals in February and those elsewhere through the year. They were history reenacted, albeit mythic history. I go into it in more detail on the separate episode of the Lupercalia, but part of the experience the Romans may have had through the ritual on the 15th was to connect to their cultural history. Along other things, the three festivals fostered a sense of community. It allowed people to mix with each other. It's easy to see why people enjoyed them. The chance for a bit to eat, to socialise, and, above it all, some serious themes. And of course, nudity. Why not? I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Up next is March, which includes another procession, albeit one involving much more dancing and a prop, sort of. Until then, keep safe and stay well.